And welcome. It's Monday, 1 o'clock. Welcome to the Deal Doctor live stream. First things up, I want to mention there's a lot of news about the coronavirus, and a lot of you are going to be getting on airplanes, traveling. Some of you already are, whether it's within the United States or outside. And we just encourage you to be cautious, wash your hands, do what the CDC and the National Institute of Health are telling us as precautions, and I think that we'll all get through this just fine. So that's my public service announcement for the day. I had a circumstance come up over the weekend where an agent wanted to, was going to list a property, had the intention of listing. And in the course of the conversation, the seller explained that they had a buyer already in place, that they wanted the agent to simply write up the offer, but to represent them. And in the course of the conversation, the question of whether or not that required a listing contract or not came up. And the answer is, no, you don't have to have a listing contract. You can do it with a listing contract, and a listing contract does have certain protections that, for example, a compensation agreement doesn't have, like protection periods and putting it on the multiple listing and so on and so forth. But to make it easy, I suggested that she do a compensation agreement, that she accomplish this task by simply filling out a compensation agreement. Some of you may not know that we actually have such a thing that is called a compensation agreement. We do. Is my phone ringing? Okay, you shut it off?
Put on silent.
All right. So, in the compensation agreement, it starts right off the top: date, property address, legal description. And it says, before you disclose confidential information to a real estate licensee regarding a real estate transaction, you should ask for a disclosure of agency relationship to understand the type of agency relationship each party of the transaction has with that licensee. No big surprise there. The five-star real estate agent, let's say in this case, Don Phelan. Put my name in there, and here I would indicate whether I'm working for the seller, or I'm working for the buyer, or I'm working as a transaction coordinator. It's very simple and straightforward. The seller side commission. If I'm going to be collecting commission from the selling side, I put it here with the broker admin fee. If I'm going to be collecting from the buyer as well, I did indicate it here and put the broker admin fee. Bear in mind that every time we do a transaction where there is not another broker involved, Five Star Real Estate assumes the liability for that transaction, as well as the work required to create a new ledger and have the branch administrators review the file and so on, which is the reason that if we have another party involved, we have to charge a broker admin fee to both people unless they're represented by another agent. So then it's real simple. Then you just have the buyer and seller both sign the compensation agreement, which indicates that you're going to be paid to write up the offer and do the work to get the thing closed. So it's a really handy form to use when you want to create a paper trail, or you want to create some document that says that you're going to be paid for your work without doing a listing contract or a buyer's agency contract. There are going to be those times when a buyer's agency contract is going to be a better option, as is a listing contract. But in a situation where you're doing a FSBO, essentially, compensation agreement is a great choice. Hope that helps. Another question came up over the week, chattel agreements. I suppose I'd like to know how many of you have ever had the experience of having a mortgage lender call you and say, I see that you got a bunch of stuff, personal property, listed on the purchase agreement, like the John Deere tractor, the swimming pool equipment, the outdoor grill, whatever. And we want those to be on an addendum outside of the purchase agreement. And so the agent goes away and puts them on an addendum that they never share with the mortgage company at the mortgage company's request. Let me explain what that is. It's called mortgage fraud. We are not giving the mortgage company all of the information. And an addendum, once signed, becomes an integral part of the purchase agreement. That's the very first line of the addendum. This addendum is an integral part of the purchase agreement. So be very careful when a mortgage company says to you, take the personal property off and put it on an addendum, because that's not legal. That's not the right way to do it. If you want personal property off the purchase agreement, then use a chattel agreement. A chattel agreement is in .loop, and it is exactly for the purpose of selling chattel or personal property. For example, it says the following items to be sold for $1 to the buyers upon successful closing of the subject property at. And then, just for an example here, it says the pool table and accessories, the basement furniture and wall decorations, the family room furniture, record player system, and the sailfish over the fireplace. Dining room chairs and tables. So you can fill out a chattel agreement that is separate and apart from a purchase agreement, and it's perfectly legal to do, and it's perfectly legal to not share that with a mortgage company. But if you're putting it on an addendum and not sharing it with a mortgage company, that's a violation. So I caution you, if you're doing that, you may get caught. When I get that request from mortgage lenders, I ask them I explain to them very simply, I'll have that filled out that way, but I'm going to send it to you, and if you want to hold it in a drawer, that's your call. I'm not going to be the party to mortgage fraud. It's as simple as that. So, moving on. What else do we have to talk about? Well, for those of you who use the West Michigan Purchase Agreement and the West Michigan Regional Listing Contracts, there have been a lot of changes. I don't know if the new form has been loaded up on .loop yet or not, but it won't be long before it is. I encourage you to read the revision date January 20. So if it down here at the bottom, if it still says February of 19, that's the old one. The new one is dated down here, revision date January 20. And I encourage you to read it because there are changes, some of which I will point out. Under number 3, it says that if there are changes in the content of the disclosure statement, they have to be updated. And then it says with respect to structural mechanical appliance system prior to closing. Well, that's not exactly true. And so they struck that out, that phrase regarding with respect to the structural mechanical appliance systems prior to closing. They actually have to provide you an updated, if there's a change in the condition of the property, the seller is required to provide you an updated disclosure statement at that moment that that new information is discovered. For example, if all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they suddenly get water in the basement, first time they've ever had it, they get water in the basement, they have to disclose that to the buyer. They're required by law to disclose that to the buyer when it happens, not just prior to close, but when it happens. So that was eliminated. They've also added the box that says seller is exempt from the requirements of the Seller's Disclosure Act. And again, we've been through this before about who is and who is not exempt from the Seller's Disclosure Form. Flippers, investors, landlords are not exempt from the Seller's Disclosure Form. We are still seeing a lot of Seller's Disclosure Forms with never lived in the property, investor only, scribbled across the front. That is not an accurate or adequate seller's disclosure according to the state of Michigan. So be aware and know what the exemptions are. Some of them are new construction, never occupied, an estate, offhand, I can't. I'm struggling to remember them all. Anything to do with a judgment from the court, foreclosure, divorce, guardianship, any of those kinds of things. I believe we have that on the Resource Center, but it's really easy to Google Michigan Seller's Disclosure Form exemptions, and it will pull it up and show you exactly who is exempt from filling out the Seller's Disclosure Form. Don't mark that box if you don't know that the party is exempt from providing a seller's disclosure form. Then they clarified this a bit here with a mailing address of. Before it was a little bit muddy in this what you put in this line. And parcel ID number. So they just clarified that a little. Again, it's good to go through and read this. They changed the word good faith deposit to earnest money deposit, which is more common nowadays to refer to the earnest money deposit. Under cash, it specifies if verifications is not received within 5 days after the effective date, seller may terminate this agreement at any time before verifications is received by giving written notice to buyer. So, we very often get cash offers that aren't actually cash. They're subject to somebody getting money out of a 401k. They're subject to getting a check from the National Bank of Grandma. They're subject to all sorts of things, proceeds from the sale of a house and the closing of that sale that the agent doesn't tell us about, but they're not liquid funds in a demand deposit account. That's a checking account, savings account, or money market. So what they've added here is you have to prove to us that you have the money available to you in your money market, checking, or savings account within 5 days, and if you don't, then we have the right to terminate. I think it's a great addition. Page 2, item 9. If the existing sale this is in box number 2 where it says is subject to the sale or the closing of an existing sale, underlying sale, in order to make this sale in effect. What happens if that underlying sale falls apart? Does that buyer have a responsibility to this seller to let them know? Yes. Does it happen? No. So they added a phrase. It says, if the existing sale terminates for any reason, buyer will immediately notify seller, and either party may terminate this agreement in writing within 3 days of buyer's notice to seller. If either party terminates, buyer shall receive a refund of any applicable earnest money deposit. So that helps clarify what is supposed to happen if that underlying sale falls apart. They've also gone through and addressed some of the issues that we have nowadays that we may not have had in the past. And they had put the unless rented overarching phrase in here that says all of this stuff, unless it's rented, is included in the sale. And they've added attached security systems. So down here where it talks about the water softener, that plays back to the unless it's rented. Same thing with fuel tanks, unless it's rented. So in most cases, fuel tanks are going to be rented. But it's one of those things that on rare occasions, a seller may actually own the fuel tanks, and both the listing agent and the selling agent need to understand what the situation is, whether they are owned or rented by the seller. So that's part of both parties' due diligence. They also talk about the heating and cooling, cooking fuels, heating and cooking fuels. And they have to have this 10% in the tanks at the time of possession, except what is used through normal usage. That they've struck that, and it's so hard. I think because it's so hard to verify this and to enforce it, it's almost impossible. So your buyer needs to be aware, and the seller need to be aware of what's in the tank at the time of possession, and whether it needs to get refilled as soon as possible. Pretty much everything else there is on page 3 is striking a bunch of words that don't need to be there. Now, property survey. As I've said many times before, the only thing that is a property survey, a true survey, is a boundary survey. A mortgage sketch is not a survey. So they changed the language of paragraph 18 to say that the buyer or seller will, within 10 days of the effective date, at their expense, order a boundary survey certified to buyer with iron corner stakes showing the location of the boundaries, improvements, and easements in connection with the property. Upon receipt of the survey, buyer will have 3 days to review the survey. If the survey shows any condition in buyer's sole discretion, which would interfere with the buyer's intended use of the property, the marketability of title, or zoning noncompliance, and the buyer may, within 3 days said period, terminate this agreement in writing, and the buyer will receive full refund of earnest money deposit. This situation has come up a number of times in the last couple of weeks, where a survey wasn't done, or a boundary survey showing the easements that are on the property, as well as marking the location of the boundaries or fences and so on, that full survey was not performed, and as a result, they didn't know whether there was an easement. They didn't know there was an easement until they got title work back, and then and finally looked at it the day before closing and went, well, what's this easement all about drainage? There's a drainage easement here, or there's a utility easement, or there's a pole barn built on the easement. All of these things need to be in the survey, included in the survey. When they ask for a survey, they're asking for a boundary survey with all of that information in it. For example, in the situation where there was a drainage survey, their intended use, as it points out in the new contract, the intended use was they were going to build a pole barn on that portion of the property. Well, the fact that they have an easement there for utilities says that they can't build that pole barn where they want to, because it's going to interfere with the drainage easement. So that's information that the buyer deserved to get before the day before the closing, or even later than that. So the new contract has addressed that issue. I'm going to stop just for a moment. I see Tammy's got a question here. And I want to go back to the actual language. Sellers are responsible for maintaining heating, and then it strikes out cooking liquid fuels at an operational level, and shall not permit fuels to fall below 10% at the time of possession, except that the tanks may be empty only if now empty. Does that explain it? No, but that's what it says, and that's all I can go by at this time. I think this is really clumsily worded and very confusing. Sellers precluded from removing tanks, fuel from the tanks other than what is in the tanks already. So, number 11, I think, is still a mess, in my opinion, but it's what it is. So that's what the best I can tell you is read paragraph 11 if you have a question on it, and we're probably going to have to go take this back to the board and say this needs to be clarified, because this really doesn't make any sense the way that it's written, the way that I have it right now. It may be clarified before they come out. Paragraph, or where to go? Page, doesn't have a page number at the top. It's got to be page 5. Again, they've changed good faith deposit. There are a lot of issues. Thanks, Leo. I appreciate your comment. Yes, I am. There are a lot of issues regarding how the earnest money is to be deposited and how it is to be dispersed. And the bottom line is that we are governed by escrow laws in the state of Michigan. And so we can't simply disperse earnest deposit because the inspections went bad. We have to get both parties to sign, because we have fiduciary duty to that escrow to make sure that it's handled properly under the laws of Michigan. So it's not. I get the call a lot. Well, the inspections went bad, so we can give the money back, can't we? No. You really need to get a mutual release signed. A similar situation where the purchase agreement ran out. The purchase agreement expired, and the agent called and said, well, we can get, everybody can get their money back. Well, no, not necessarily, because the buyer may still want to buy that property and may have a legal right to, given the fact that both parties kicked the can down the road. And we've talked about this before, that they went past the deadline, but neither of them took any action to terminate the contract. So the assumption was that they were continuing to work together to get the deal closed. And then the last thing on here, on page 6, it says, seller's approval and acknowledgement. The seller approves of the terms of this agreement and acknowledges receipt of copy. If seller's response occurs after buyer's offer expires, then seller's response is considered a counteroffer and buyer's acceptance is required below. Okay, and essentially the same terms down here. Buyers acknowledges receipt and acceptance of the counteroffer. Terms and conditions of the offer remain unchanged. Again, read the contracts that you're having your clients sign. Where are we? Listing agreement, there weren't a lot of changes on the West Michigan Regional Purchase Agreement, listing contract, except that it specifies whether the security systems are owned, rented, or not applicable. And I think there's also a paragraph 16 added, which says authorization to order services. If the seller requests broker to procure any services on behalf of the seller, then seller agrees that broker will make those contacts solely for the seller's convenience, and seller agrees to be responsible to select the service provider, retain and pay the provider, and review the results and documents that result from those contracts. Broker shall not have any liability to seller for making any referral for any service provider. And then here we go, audio surveillance. Seller understands that use of an audio surveillance device during showings, open houses in the property may result in a violation of state and or federal criminal wiretapping. Broker recommends that seller disable audio recording devices during showings and inspections, which is precisely different than what we have gotten from our attorney, which is that a seller has the right to audio record or video record in their own home anywhere that a buyer would not have a reasonable expectation of privacy, such as the bathroom. So we can advise our sellers that they may be in violation of the law if they are recording. I'm not an attorney, but I would say that that would be a pretty tough case to win. So, Leo, I don't think that they are on dot-loop yet. I think that we are in the stage of still reviewing this, it seems. This is the latest copy that I've had, which is midweek last week. So I doubt that it's on there yet. I don't think that they've actually sent it out for propagation on the various brokers' dot-loop systems. Yes, Tammy, thank you. Nice that they added that paragraph about services, but I will have them sign to say they want them and they will pay for them. I absolutely agree, even if the deal falls through. I absolutely agree. If you're going to expect to get reimbursed for photography, brochures, you better, number one, have a specific invoice. You better keep track of it, and you better have something that says very explicitly that the seller will reimburse you for any expenses should they terminate the offer or if a deal falls through. Great comment, Tammy. Thank you very much. And that's about a half hour. I hope that it helped. There are other things coming down the pike as far as some changes, but we'll get to those in another day. Thanks for joining. Hope you have a great day.